Hello and welcome back to another video. It's been a while. I've mainly been blogging in the last few months, and I've recently shared my current palette setup on my blog, and I thought it might be interesting to share what my logic behind my color choices is, why I typically change only certain colors while others stay the same, and how you can build a palette from scratch yourself. So whether you want to set up your first palette from scratch or change your current palette, we can just nerd out about colors and pigments here for a bit. And I think this is also worth watching if you just have a pre-made palette that you bought. Manufacturers follow certain logic too when they create their palettes. At least one hopes that they do. So this can also help you to understand why a certain selection was made in the first place and what you can maybe tweak and change about your colors. So when we talk about palettes, we typically mean the paint setup, but of course you'll need something to hold the paints, and often the term palette encompasses both. What I'm talking about now is the actual paint box, and I would say try to choose this based on what you need. Should it be portable or spacious or lightweight or have plenty of mixing space? So I know ideally it should have all of the above. I usually use these small metal palettes here, and I'm actually very boring in this aspect because I have used the same type of palette for many years now. This is this small metal paint box in black and white that holds between 12 and 24 colors, and these portable metal palettes have worked for me so well in the field and in the studio. And I also have bigger palettes, but I find myself returning to this compact setup. Yeah, they come with these little holders. I tend to remove them because it's just you can fit more colors in them that way. But yeah, these are the kind of palettes that I'm talking about. So there are many different types and sizes of palettes out there, and if you're just getting started, I really wouldn't overthink it and just get something that's not too expensive, that has several mixing areas so that the colors don't run into each other. Something that's easy to clean and maybe lightweight if you want to take it out with you in the field. And if you already have a palette, even one that's been pre-filled, then great, let's take a look at the color selection. So I'll talk you through the setup that I choose every time I set up a new palette, which isn't that often, honestly. And a classic setup for a balanced all-rounder palette like this one could be called an extended split primary palette, which sounds really complicated, but it's actually quite simple. So there's the term split primary. This means that you take two variants of each primary color, which are red, yellow, and blue, as your base. And those two variants are chosen based on color theory. So color theory is helpful because it structures the way we think about color and we can apply color in painting. So we can group colors by temperature into warm and cool colors. And these are not actual temperatures or anything, but it's just how we perceive them. So you could say that reds and oranges and yellows are warmer colors because they remind us of warm things like fire and the sun. And then there are cool colors like blues and greens, which remind us of, snow and ice and the cold. So for our split primary palette, this just means you will take primary colors, red, blue, yellow, but you'll take a warm and a cool version of each of your primary colors to have a good base to mix from. So let's do this just now. Okay, great. We already have 6 colors in our palette. And we have our warm primaries, so a warm yellow, a warm red, and a warm blue. And cool primaries, that is a cool yellow, a cool red, and a cool blue. And it can be helpful to imagine these on a color wheel. This is a way to visualize those color relationships we were talking about. And as you can see, those 6 colors cover a lot of ground. We have our warm and cool yellow, our warm and cool red, and our warm and cool blue. And these are actually all of the colors in my palette, and we'll talk a bit more about those now. So with these 6 colors alone, you can already mix quite a big range of really bright and vibrant colors. However, it's not always convenient to mix everything from scratch, and you also want some colors that, some mixes that are more muted. So we should actually add in a few more colors, and this is the extended part of the split primary palette. I typically add earth tones to my palette, not only because they're a classic addition to any painter's palette, but because they can create natural and beautiful mixes, especially neutrals, and we definitely need those in our sketches. And you can think of earth tones as slightly muted and less saturated versions of your primary color. So if we go back to the color wheel, a yellow ochre is a slightly muted version of a yellow, and a burnt sienna is a muted version of an orange or a red. And so these earth tones group towards the middle of this color wheel when we think about sort of the brightest versions of these colors live here, and as we go into the wheel, they get less saturated and more muted. I also typically extend my primary color choices if I want more variety, so I often include a third or even fourth blue or red to the mix, because I know I will use it frequently for my skies or for mixing. So I always have at least these 3 blues in my palette: cerulean, cobalt and ultramarine blue. So this is a nice sort of middle blue. And I also have this second cool red here, which is great for landscape. So this is a perylene maroon, and I already have this really cool pink, and this red here, which is a vermilion. Then there are colors that technically could be mixed but are convenient to have around, like green. So I always have this sap green as a base for all of my greens, because it's just more convenient to pick up a little bit of green and then mix in some blue or some yellow, depending on what I need. And then there are some colors that are maybe brighter as a single pigment. So like this orange, opposed to what I can mix with these colors, sometimes it's just more convenient to have this orange around. So I like to add this to my palette. Other colors that fall into this area are violets. I also typically have a white and a black in my palette, so let's just add these in. And I use the white for adding highlights and the black for items that are truly black. This is also a color that could be omitted if you don't need it that often. And this is basically a good framework for an extended split primary palette. I also have a cool green here that I like to have around, and another dark warm blue that I like, and because you can never have enough blues. So this is my palette currently. Now I can go and clean the gunk out of this other palette here. And yeah, this is a framework for how you can build your palette. It can be changed depending on what you need. For example, one year I used to paint lots of botanical sketches, so I put in additional magenta and purple pigments into my palette and switched out a few of the other ones. And you will notice that you will use certain colors a lot. These are sort of the backbone of your palette, and others maybe not so much, and these are the flexible elements that can change over time. You see that I have a slightly larger selection of colors in my palette, always between 18 and 22. Some painters prefer smaller numbers of colors. You can also build really nice mini limited palettes, and these will give your sketches a unified and very harmonious look. So over the years, I've always come back to this basic setup, and my most recent setup is a good all-rounder for all kinds of subjects. You can get the full list of pigments on my blog or as a handy PDF if you sign up to my newsletter. And of course, I've added the pigment number for each color because The paint companies like to make us mad with their random color names that can mean different hues for each brand. So if you want to learn more about pigments, you should always refer to the pigment number rather than the name of the pigment, because that can be quite random. And for each of these pigments, there's at least one great alternative that you could use instead, except maybe ultramarine blue. So you see, there are a lot of possibilities to put together your palette. Paint companies usually have documentation and sometimes also mention if the color is warm or cool. And there are also great resources like Jane Blundell's blog or the site handprint.com, where you can take a deep dive and learn more about the properties of different watercolor pigments. So I really recommend learning more about colors, about pigments, about color theory. And another thing too is when you're selecting colors, ask yourself, what do I typically paint? What do I want to paint? What are the colors that I gravitate toward? What are colors I do want to experiment with, and what subjects do I paint? You maybe need different colors for nature than you would need for people or for city sketches. And I also have some colors in this palette don't really make sense. For example, this cool green, I don't really use it that often, but it makes me happy as a color. I also used to have another blue. I used to have 5 blues in my palette, and one of them was this really bright, cool blue, manganese blue. I didn't really need it for painting skies, but it just made me happy to see it, so I had it in my palette for a very, very long time. A few practical aspects. I typically arrange the colors in my palette so that similar colors sit next to each other and aren't as quickly contaminated when I pick up paint. So I try to put the yellows together and the blues together. And that's not always possible, of course, with such a compact palette. So it's always a compromise. So for example, I have my green sitting next to the reds, which is not optimal, but yeah, it typically works, and you will get mud into your palette anyway. So yeah. You'll have to clean it from time to time anyway. Then we have these different pan sizes here. Colors that I use very often typically go in full pan. So my blues, this green, the ochre. One exception is that I might still have an existing pan of a color I want to use up, like this Parallel Maroon. I didn't have a half pan, so I just inserted the full pan. And I didn't want to start a new half pan, but I will just use it up, and then I will probably switch my burnt sienna to a larger palette, because I need this actually more often. I mentioned earlier that I removed this metal holder from the palette so that I have more space in my palette. And you might ask yourself, well, how do your pans stick in the palette? How do they stay put? And I have added to each of my pans here a piece of magnet tape on the bottom, so that they will all stay in place very nicely. If you don't, well, I guess if you would shake them, you'd shake the palette upside down, they will come out, but I typically don't do this, so it's fine. I also note the name or the number of the pigment on the side of the pen, because yes, we all forget this kind of stuff. And I also like a clean palette, so I remove the muddy mixtures and the gunk on top of the pans from time to time when I refill especially. And I do this more often with the yellows, because the yellow, you want to have a clear yellow. So this is how I set up my watercolor palette from scratch, how I choose colors. Let me know what your process looks like, what your favorite colors in your palette are, and if you found this helpful, you can like and subscribe and all of the other stuff, and maybe most importantly, join my blog newsletter, where you will get more posts like this and great resources for sketching, drawing and painting. Thank you for watching, and I will see you very soon. Bye!